Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Dawes, and I will be your host today for our ongoing series of lesser-known included tools within SOLIDWORKS. And today's topic is going to be DriveWorksXpress. First off, I want to make sure that everyone can both see my screen and hear my voice. So if you give me a little raise hand button within GoToMeeting, that would help me out. All right, I saw Mike there hop in first. Thanks, Mike. Then we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like everybody can see and hear me. The first thing I wanted to cover is that this is a subset of a presentation I've given a couple of times where the larger theme was design automation. And we kind of go through the growth of a company using SOLIDWORKS and the technology they can use in design automation. And the first being SOLIDWORKS configurations, then the included tool of DriveWorksXpress, and then the purchasable tools of DriveWorks Solo or DriveWorks Pro. So I'm going to touch on SOLIDWORKS configurations and why we would even want to go to DriveWorks. And I'll touch on DriveWorks Professional at the end, but not very much. Our big focus today is going to be on DriveWorks Express. So the start of it, though, is a little bit before Express. And I know I kind of data dump on this slide for you. But this is where if I'm with a customer and I see something like this from them, it screams DriveWorks to me. So they've gotten past the initial stage of using SOLIDWORKS configurations, of just hopping between the configuration tree and the feature tree, suppressing and unsuppressing features, changing dimensions per configurations, and they've gotten to the point of using an Excel spreadsheet, like you see in front of you, to drive configurations within SOLIDWORKS. And I'm going to jump into SOLIDWORKS in this Excel spreadsheet to show you some things about it. This is the spreadsheet that I'm using to drive a bunch of different sockets. They're all the same type of design, but they're different drive sizes, they're different cylinder diameters, different finishes, different materials, and whether or not it's a 6-point or a 12-point socket. And there are a bunch of different benefits that we can get from using Excel to drive this design automation and creating new models, basically, within configurations based on just an input into a table. So if this is something you're interested in, please email me. I'll have my email up at the end of this presentation, and we can talk over it, or maybe just let our marketing team know that you want to see something like this. But some of the benefits that we can do is some of the simple ones are like the diameter of the cylinder is actually driven. If you see up top here in the function, it's actually driven off of the value, the size of the socket, and then +6 for a wall thickness. So we can add equations into Excel to drive different values within the model. So that's one example. Another example here is driving the depth of a feature, so a feature's dimension, on a logic statement. So in this case, I'm saying if the cell before it, so this cell for the cylinder diameter, is 30, then I want the depth of this cut to be 16. Otherwise, I want it to be 8. So we can use logic statements inside of Excel to drive those kinds of things. We can use Excel to drive whether a feature is suppressed or unsuppressed, and that's how I'm handling whether this is a 6-point or a 12-point socket. I can drive the material. I can link it to the actual SOLIDWORKS material database and change the material within the model, which then, downstream will affect the things like weight and center of mass and all that kind of thing. And then I have finish as a drop-down list. So that's something neat that Excel can do, is data validation. So instead of just being able to type anything into the cell, we give a user a drop-down list to choose from. And then I think the craziest example that I've got in this table is actually the description column. So I want to be able to fill out a custom property of description for each one of these, and I want the description to be driven by all the model's values after it. So in that case, I'm using another kind of, I guess I'll call it a logic statement within Excel, but it's called concatenate. So I'm basically just taking all of the values afterward, and I'm adding things like formatting. So I add the PT So it says 12 point, 12 millimeter tall, 6 drive, because we could have different drive sizes maybe, and then the finish, so black oxide or chrome. Driving configurations and doing some design automation through Excel is really powerful, but I think you probably see right away that you need a lot of knowledge to do this of the tool, and really it's probably on the designer's shoulders to manage this spreadsheet. So that's the first thing. And then the other is, this is a set of sockets. So based on my things that I can configure, my orange here is a 12 millimeter socket, and my 13 in my green here is a 13 millimeter socket. And you can see that I have 16 different options per size based on a 6 point, a tall, a short, what material it is, and what finish I have. And I've got it illustrated here. I'll go ahead and close this. And you can see how this drives the SOLIDWORKS model if I jump into SOLIDWORKS. Now that I'm in SOLIDWORKS, you can see that once I close that table, over here in the left-hand column, I have a bunch of configurations that are representative of that table. So as I double-click through here, you'll be able to see that I have a 6-point socket, I have a short 12-point socket, and that's all driven from the Excel design table. And based on that combination, I've got 32. So I'm going to go ahead and close this and jump back into my PowerPoint. So I think the first, really the limitation there is just the ease of use for maybe a user that's not a SOLIDWORKS user, somebody that wants to drive some design automation but is not a SOLIDWORKS user. And then the other is just the number of configurations that we're going to be pumping into this model. So I've kind of got that shown on this next slide here. I was actually at Moe's the other day for lunch, and I saw this sign hanging up in the background. So that is 17 quintillion different combinations based on the ingredients that they have, just showing you that they've got lots of different options depending on what ingredients that you want. And it got me thinking about this idea of the different number of combinations that we can have when we're driving a model. So in my example, I'm driving 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things. And I have 2 options for each of them. I have 2 different sizes, the 13 millimeter and the 14 millimeter. I have 2 different depths, a tall and a short. I have 2 different types, a 6-point or a 12-point socket. I had 2 different materials and 2 different finish types. So how that works is you just multiply the number of options together, and you get 32 different options. And you start to see how that can grow really quickly. If I have 3 different sizes, I just add 1 size. I'm adding 1 different combination. I add another 16 different configurations to my model and make that 48. Well, if I want to make this a full-blown socket set, I'd need 17 sizes from 4 millimeters to 20 millimeters, and I want to add an additional 2 finishes. So I had chrome, black oxide, now I want just polish and matte. And that gets to be 544 different configurations. And that really affects our SOLIDWORKS models and the assemblies that those models might go into. As just a reference here, I just looked at the properties of the file after each step of this. If I had no configurations in the model, it's about 93 kilobytes, and then it grows pretty rapidly. When I had the 32 different models, it was 515. We got close to 2 megs when we get to 48, and then we have about 20 megs when we get to my full socket set. So that can be a really a detriment to our software performance when we're having it calculate all of these different configurations. And when we start putting these into assemblies and using multiple of them in an assembly, it can get a little out of hand. So when I start to see tables like that, or even if I see a big, if I go into the equations part of SOLIDWORKS and I see a big list of equations that are solving, it kind of screams to me that we should be looking at DriveWorks and DriveWorksXpress. So to DriveWorksXpress, I'll go through the workflow here, and we're actually going to build up the same example in DriveWorksXpress and show some of the differences and show how it's done. The workflow looks like that. It is you capture, and the things that you can capture are dimensions, features, custom properties, and you can capture drawings as well, but I won't be doing that in this example. Then we create our form. We design our form, and we build the controls that are on that form. In this case, you'll see that that's my serial file name. I'm going to drive a file name, the socket size, the socket type, whether it's 6-point or 12-point, the height, whether it's short or tall, and the finish. So we'll get the exact same type of design automation, but instead of creating one file with a ton of configurations in it, and that we really need to know how that Excel table functions, we'll just present the SOLIDWORKS user with a table, and they can fill it out, and when they hit create, it'll create a brand new model. So we're creating a brand new model each time. And then rule 3 is actually connecting these form controls to the values in the model. So you can see that I have socket size here is 15. Somehow I need to push that 15 into my value in the model that's called across flats. So we'll go through that. First things first, though, we got to know how to turn it on. I just put this out here for a visual reference, but we'll go through it together. We go down to Tools, Express Products, and then we choose DriveWorksXpress. If it's the very first time you're turning on DriveWorksXpress, you'll get that window in the middle that shows that you need to get on to my.solidworks.com/express, and they'll give you an activation code. So there's no purchase necessary with this, but you do need to create a My SolidWorks account. So you just create that My SolidWorks account and go to that page, and it's going to provide you with that last window of your activation code for DriveWorksXpress. Obviously, I've already activated mine, so we won't see this. But if I jump back into SolidWorks here, to turn it on, we're going to go to Tools, Express Products, DriveWorksXpress. DriveWorksXpress is really run the whole time through this window in the task pane on the right, and you can see that little blue square with the red square on top of it. That's my DriveWorksXpress window. I'm going to go ahead and pin that so it doesn't go away when I click off in space. Then we can create or change a database, we can add or edit projects, and we can run projects from here. So we're going to start one from scratch, and I'm going to choose Create or Change a Database. And I'll give my database a name. I'm just going to call this Socket Test. And then we need to do our capturing. So I need a model to be able to grab from. I'll hit the Browse button. If I had a model already open, I could choose this option to use the open model. But we'll go ahead and browse for our option here. This is under... There's my socket. One of the tips that I give people when they're starting with configurations in general, Excel configurations, or in DriveWorks, is to show your features, your dimensions, and your names of those features and dimensions. So to do that, you can go to the Annotations folder in the feature tree, just right-click on that, and choose Show Feature Dimensions. That'll just show all of the dimensions that control the model. And then if you go to the eyeball at the top in the heads-up display, this Hide Show Items, I'm going to turn on this D1 here, which is View Dimension Names. You can see that I've gone through and I've given names to all of my dimensions. That just makes it a lot easier when you're capturing these to know what you're capturing. Otherwise, it would just be D1 at Sketch 1, D2 at Sketch 1, D1 at Sketch 2, which gets, as you start gathering a bunch of different things that you're capturing, is hard to read and hard to go back and change as you build up this project. So I went ahead and renamed all those dimensions. Back to the capture. We've already gone through how to capture the model. Then our next screen is going to be capturing our dimensions and features. So we're going to be able to capture a feature, to suppress and unsuppress it. I'm going to grab 4 different dimensions. I'm going to grab 3 new custom properties that I'm going to feed into the model, and then we'll skip the drawings part of this project. So back in SolidWorks, over in the right-hand window of our DriveWorks, I'm going to hit Dimensions at Features and Features at the very bottom right. And then I just go out in space and click on the things that I want to capture. So the first thing I want to capture is the 12-point feature from the feature tree. That shows up in my list. At this point, I could rename it, which is nice, but I've already got those names in there, and it'll automatically bring in the name if I've already named it. I'll hit the Add button. Now that gets added to my folder for features of things that I'm going to drive with DriveWorks Express. Then we'll move on to dimensions, and I'm going to grab the across flats value and hit Add. We'll grab the hex depth and hit Add. I'm going to grab the cylinder depth and finally the cylinder diameter. So I've captured all the features and dimensions I want. Now I'll go down to the bottom here again, and I'm going to go to the Custom Properties tab. And I can just type in names, and that will then create these custom properties in my generated models. So the first one I want is description. Then I want finish. And I want part number. If you already had custom properties in the model, they would show up in this list, but they wouldn't be checked. So if you want to drive those through DriveWorks Express and you already have those custom properties in there, you would just check mark next to the custom property name that you already had in there. And like I said, we're going to skip the drawings and configurations portion of this. Once we've captured our model, our features and dimensions, our custom properties, and optionally our drawing, then we're going to go to the form design. In the form design, we basically add controls to fill out a form. In this case, we're going to do a serial file name, the socket type, the height, and the finish. Back to our model. So to do that, along the very top of DriveWorks Express, you can see that I've got this capture button, I've got the form button, and I've got the rules button. So I'm going to go into the form, and I'm going to start to add controls to my form. This first one, I'm going to hit Add, and I'm going to call it serial file name. And it's going to be a text box, a numeric text box, and I want the minimum value to be 0, let's call it 1, and the maximum value to be 99,999. So we're creating some rules here as well, which you'll see when we preview this form, that if I'm outside of the bound of this rule, it won't let me go on to the next stage. I'll hit Create, and now I've got a new control there that I could select and hit Edit or Delete, but in this case we're going to just add another control. This one we're going to call Socket Size. It's also going to be a numeric text box, and I only want people to be able to create sockets between the size of 4 and 20 millimeters. I'll hit Create. We'll add another control. This time it's going to be socket type, and we'll do a different type of control. Instead of a numeric text box, we're going to choose a drop down. And in the drop down, this might be a little tricky. I know I get some calls about this every once in a while. I'm going to give it my first option, which is going to be 6-point, but I can't hit enter. Hopefully you can hear me hitting enter there, and it's not going to the next line. You don't hit enter and go to the next line. You actually use the pipe, which is actually shift and the button above your enter key. We'll put in a pipe bar there, and then I'll put in my next option. And if you wanted more options, you would just keep hitting that, inserting that pipe, and that would give you more options. But I just want a 6-point and a 12-point option for socket type, and hit Create. We'll do the same thing for height. I want a drop down, and I want the options to be tall and short. Then we're going to do one for finish. That's also going to be a drop down. And I want chrome and black oxide. So there's our form. We can preview this form anytime we want to by hitting the test button. And that's going to show what our form is going to look like as we run this project. And you can see that I have these warning signs next to each one of them because I marked each one of these inputs as required. as I made those controls, there was just a little check mark box in there that's called required, and I made each one of these required. Those rules that I set up for the numeric text boxes, I can actually see those if I hover over the input box. It says type a numeric value for this serial file name between 1 and that 99999. So if I type in 4, that warning goes away. But if I type in 0, that warning stays. So I'm actually building rules into this input box to make sure somebody can't create an incorrect or an invalid version of this model. I'm going to go back into design mode. We're done with the form creation. And we'll go back to our PowerPoint to show the next stage of this. The next stage is the rules builder. Somehow we have to connect our form and our controls that we just made to the actual model in SOLIDWORKS. And we do that through this DriveWorksXpress rule builder. We can use different inputs like the previously created controls, so we can relate controls to each other just like we did in Excel. We can use math statements, we can use logic statements, all to build up all of our different rules that we want. So we'll hop back in and we'll make these rules to drive the model. Again, the buttons up top, the capture, the form, and the rules. I'm going to go to the rules option there, and you can see all of the different types of rules that I have within my project. I have 1 file name rule, I have 3 custom property name rules, 4 dimension rules, 1 feature rule, and I can edit these individually, but I'm just going to check mark the total and hit edit rules. That'll take me to a screen that lists all of the rules that I need to fill out, and you're going to see that they all have red X's on them. That means I don't have a rule for them yet. At the very bottom here, I will show you that it says show missing rules only. So as I create these rules, they'll disappear from this list. And for the file name, I'll just double click that. It'll bring up the rules builder, and I'm going to hook the file name to whatever somebody types in for the serial file name. Easy as that. I just use the inputs drop down and pick one of the controls that I have set up. The across flats rule, I'll double click it, and I'm going to link that to the socket size. The hex depth rule. This one's going to be a logic statement, and I can either choose them from here, like logic. I've got this if statement, and, or, not, greater than, equal to, or you can just type these out. I'm going to hit equals, and then if the height, so I can use the inputs, is equal to 30. I'm sorry, if the height is equal to the word tall, then I want it to be 16. Otherwise, I want it to be 8. Once my rule's valid, that screen goes from red to white, and when I hit OK, we're good to go. For the cylinder depth, I'm going to say another if statement. If height equals tall, I want it to be 30 millimeters tall. Otherwise, I want it to be 15 millimeters tall. For the cylinder diameter, I want it to be the socket size, and then plus a 6 millimeter wall thickness. For our feature, that 12-point feature, I want the rule to be if the socket type return equals 6 point, then I want this feature suppressed, and I just type in that word, suppress. Otherwise, I want it to be unsuppressed. The description is pretty easy. I'm sorry, we'll do that one last. The finish is pretty easy. We're going to just bring that from finish and fill out that custom property. Same thing with the part number. We're going to hook that same thing to serial file name. So the file name and the part number are going to be the same in this case. And then the description is the neat one here. I can build it up. We don't really need a concatenate in front of this, but it works very much the same way as Excel. So I want this to be equal to the socket type. And then I just use this ampersand sign, and I can add things to it like If I do a quote, space, quote, it just sticks a space in between this value and the next. And I'll say, and socket size, and millimeter space, and height, and space, and finish. And I've got something wrong in there. HEIGHT. There we go. That red to the white really helps you out to know if you've got any syntax errors. So basically in this point, it's going to say like 6-point space, 12 millimeter space, tall or short space, and then whether it's black oxide or chrome. And that'll fill out my description custom property. Once my list here is empty, that means I've created all the rules I need to create. And I just run the project. So let's run an example of this project. I'm going to give it a serial name and a part number. I'm going to give it a socket size. We'll make maybe a 17 millimeter socket size. The socket type is going to be maybe a 6-point, and I want it to be a short one, and I want it to be black oxide. When I hit create, DriveWorks does its thing, generates that model, and actually saves that as a new model to wherever my database is stored, that thing we created at the very beginning. So if I go to my desktop here, where I saved my socket test file, it's going to push that file out to there. Back to the PowerPoint. So we just went through running the project, setting up a bunch of controls and spitting that out. I did want to show you, I wanted a super simple one to keep this to be a short webinar, but one that's already been created that I'll run through here. We'll go ahead and close this example. And I'm going to pull up one that I've already created that's been a little bit more, a little beefier of a presentation. Which one do I want to run here? I'll grab that hydraulic cylinder. Tools, DriveWorksXpress. This one has a drop down for drawn by, a bore value, a stroke in inches, what clevis we're using, a pressure range that we want, and then a port size that we want. So we're really just pushing all of the values that we want into the model. And I hit create, and this time it's actually going to create an assembly, building up the individual components, driving drawings, and then at the tail end here, it will assemble all of those individual components into a SOLIDWORKS assembly file. While we're waiting here, feel free to use the chat section of GoToMeeting and type in any questions that you have so far about setting up a DriveWorks project or running a DriveWorks project. All right, looks like no questions are coming in, and our assembly drawing is finally being made. And there's the end of that project. So really a simple process up front to be able to drive a ton of different versions of a model that you have, being able to build in some simple rules to drive some intelligence into that model. So the next step on this, like I said, I'll just touch on this. We covered the kind of the growth step beforehand, which would be that Excel-based configurations. The growth step after DriveWorks Express, which is included in SOLIDWORKS, is DriveWorks Pro. Now, this is a purchased tool. This is not included, but I figure you should know if you're kind of graduating beyond DriveWorks Express, pushing its limits to too much, then there are other options out there, specifically from DriveWorks. And it's a really similar workflow too. You capture the things that you want to capture. In this type, there's some more options, like file types, that bullet point number 5, where you can actually capture different model types that you want to push out when you generate it. So in this example that I have, the downloads section at the end, you can check mark at the end whether you want a step or a parasolid file to also generate. The form design and the controls, the model rules builder is just way more powerful. It's a kind of a VB, Visual Basic-esque form designer, rather than just that real simple window with some simple inputs for logic statements. You can really put some power into this form. The other piece that we kind of didn't cover is that with DriveWorks Express, you need to have DriveWorks. So DriveWorks Express only works by running the project through SOLIDWORKS. So you need a SOLIDWORKS license. With DriveWorks Pro, there are options to be able to push this out internally to your company. You can put it on an internal website, or you can even put it on an external website. So whether or not you put it behind a firewall or not, this form could be on your web page where somebody fills out a form to get a quote for a socket from you. So that would be the next step, but to keep this short, I think this was a half-an-hour webinar, and I'm going slightly over. So that's the end. Again, if you want any of the content that I made here, please reach out. My name is Greg Dawes again, and that is my personal email. Let's put my work email on there. That's better.